So hello and welcome to the next edition of Fridays with Fintelekt. My name is Shirish Pathak. I head Fintelekt Advisory Services. And for those of you who don't know what we do, we are focused on research, training, and advisory in the area of AML and CFT and related areas. My guest today is Duncan Jepson, the founder and managing director of Liberty Shared, which was previously known as Liberty Asia. As many of you already know, Liberty Shared is a leading global anti-trafficking NGO working on countering of modern slavery and wildlife trafficking. So Liberty Shared has designed and runs freedomcollaborative.org and several other data and intelligence gathering platforms. Before starting Liberty Shared, Duncan was the regional general counsel and head of compliance in the financial services industry across Asia Pacific for nearly 15 years. And before that, worked in corporate finance. Before practicing law, he worked in manufacturing and supply chain management between China and the UK. So Duncan is currently a director of the Fair Rubber Association, the Traffic Analysis Data Hub, and also SynTalk, which is the Center on Illicit Networks and Transnational Organized Crime. So Duncan, welcome to this edition of Fridays with Fintelekt.
Welcome, Shirish, and thank you very much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure.
Super. So Duncan, let me jump straight into it. At the outset, could you take our audience through the Liberty Shared journey so far? Maybe what were the circumstances and motivation for you to start the organization, and also a glimpse of the goals you have for it to evolve into going forward?
I mean, it started from a confluence of sort of events in my own life. One, I was working at ING at the time, and it was a big company. It had a huge presence across APAC, and at that time, I had also become very interested and I suppose much more committed to social issues. I'd raised a small fund to support a girls' school in Afghanistan, and I went there in 2005. And I was on my own, and I had a friend who was there who put me in touch with a young man to drive me around, and we visited the football club, which, if anyone knows the history of the football stadium in Kabul, then it was the place that was used by the Taliban for their sort of hearings, judicial hearings, and there was, the penalty there often was violent for those who were victims of those hearings. When we were standing outside there, and the young man asked me, do I want to go in? And I said, not particularly, no. And he asked whether I knew what had happened, and I said, yes, I'd heard. And he said that he'd been to matches. And I said, that must have, what can one say other than that must have been horrendous? And he said, well, it was, but it wasn't as bad as, across the road where his martial arts studio was, because the Taliban had allowed martial arts to continue. And that had been hit by a missile, Hazari missile, and everyone had died. But he said to me, in leaving, he said, sort of finishing, he said, but none of it was as terrible as the work we do for the charity, going to find young boys and girls who have been trafficked into Peshawar, across into the border. And he said, when I find them, and they have been used for organ trafficking, then they are obviously not, most of them have died, and their organs have been harvested. And he was extremely upset for a few moments, and I'd not really grasped that there was that level of organization and horror in the sort of whole scope of human trafficking. Because ING obviously was involved mostly in investment work, wholesale banking and insurance, that old bank insurance model, my sort of the application of thinking about this to my professional life was, well, who are we investing in, and what do we know about them? And it was more of a personal interest. And so in the sort of late 2000s, I started speaking to NGOs as some of them I was donating to, some I would just ask and say, well, what do you really know about the people who are perpetrators, the companies that might be using forced labor? And I realized that there really wasn't very much information. They would tell me things, oftentimes they'd heard in the press, oh, it's it's this brand or it's that brand. This brand had a problem. And, as you know, what we're looking for in issues that relate to crime or liability, we're looking for actual names, we're looking for the specifics, and they simply weren't available. And so as we went through the 2008, and obviously there were some big fines for money laundering, and the Patriot Act had a huge effect as well, coming out, causing a lot of changes towards counter-terrorist financing and drug trafficking, so there was suddenly this huge AML structure that could be possibly used to the benefit of something like human trafficking and wildlife trafficking. And so what I realized was, is it possible to build a structure that captures the information? And of course, being, I guess, a corporate lawyer and doing a lot of corporate structuring, the next question is what role can a charity possibly play in gathering that information? And that's the question I don't think is asked very much. A charity is not a natural legal vehicle to be using it to capture information to send to banks. And that, I think, is an important point. It's skipped over in this sort of voracious hunger for more and more information. People forget about this infrastructure and the substructures that are required to actually gather that information. And stop talking. That was the role I wanted Liberty Asia to play, to be the gatherer of information and to analyze it and to move it on to somebody who could act on it.
Right. So, Duncan, what about going forward? I mean, you've given us the background. What would you say Liberty Shared will look like a few years down the line?
So we have these platforms, and I think we've done, over the last, it's now been 10 years for me, and 7 years, I suppose, in the case that most people have known of it. We have platforms that are gathering information, that have partners. The information isn't just available. It has to be agreed upon with each partner if they're interested in sharing it. The quality of what's gathered needs to be better. Whether it gets used for AML or not is then a separate question. But what you think about is that you want the platforms to grow. You want the quality of the information gathered to improve, and to improve a lot. You need the recipients who at the moment, just hunting data down as if it's sort of hiding out in caves, to think that sort of capture it and then say, well, how can it help us? There's been a sort of stock and flow problem. There's a huge amount of data that was on the internet that has been scraped by various different types of algorithm, but the flow of data coming into that is not as voluminous as you'd want. And what we're doing is that as a community, and I suppose as a society, is there's a lot of analyzing, a lot of visualizing, but there is not enough data capture. So where do I want it to be? I want it to be contributing to essentially just better data capture. And we have the platforms. We need to do it more in a more partnership and a community-based way, so that there's simply less emphasis on Liberty Shared being some sort of central point and it being far much more of a network. It's too ungainly and too clumsy if there's one NGO at the center of something, or even partially at the center. It needs to be spread. There's that old Stanley McChrystal quote of, well, now it's old, it takes a network to defeat a network. You just can't do it by building an empire, and it's not going to happen with NGOs. They're not stable, they're not well resourced, and eventually the logistics fail. I mean, it's a classic case. So that's where I want it to be, is working on a community basis, building and helping there to be better data capture and higher data quality.
Right, excellent. I think I like what you said, it takes a network to beat another network. So, I hope you find success in building that network. Duncan, I think all of us know that, yes, trafficking is a problem, whether it's human trafficking, wildlife trafficking, modern slavery, whatever term you use for it, whether it's humans or animals, But can you help our viewers understand, what would you say is the true extent of the problem? What are the trends that you're seeing? And also maybe cover some of the geopolitical issues that have influenced these trends,
Sure.
either positively or otherwise in the last few years.
I mean, I think we have to start with the idea, because there's a lack of data, we don't really know the full extent. Often what is, in relation to sort of across the movement and exploitation of resources, whether those are humans, whether it's wildlife, whether it's environmental, natural capital, what the problem is that we focused a lot on the parts that we know. So there will be those people who have an interest in organized crime. So they'll see it through the lens of organized crime, which means that you really miss forced labor completely, because, whilst the movement of people, as Professor Lindquist and wrote in his paper on the recruitment infrastructure, whilst a lot of it is organized criminal activities, it's not gang necessarily an organized international organized crime group. So looking at it through a lens of organized crime completely misses forced labor, really, but it focuses on sex trafficking. If you look at it from your motivation, say emotionally, then you might be drawn towards sex trafficking. You might be drawn towards parts of forced labor, but you're not going to look at it necessarily at a systemic level. So the question is how are you as an individual or as a group looking at the problem, and what are your kind of confirmation biases as to the way that you see it? At the moment, there's a lot of that. So the extent of the problem isn't really fully understood, and at present there's no way it could be, because the data of it is so poor. So that's the first thing to say, is that there's a lot that we simply don't know, and that's sort of a definitional level. People will question, for instance, the debate about child labor. Some people will put that into human trafficking, into forced labor, but there's an argument that economically there must be some boundaries, because in some cases it is useful for children to work at some point. But where that line in the sand is much argued. So a lot of these things, these nuances, are also, often they slip by a lot of people in their speed to do something. So the other thing that you say, and which I think is important, is there isn't really a canon of intellectual or academic study on the problem. The problem of trafficking and forced labor and wildlife trafficking, they're really a sort of it's a space of multiple domains. Whether you pick law, or you pick the practice of law enforcement, or whether you pick the sort of financial end, the policy end, whether sociological, migration studies. There's a whole range of intellectual and academic disciplines that have looked at various parts of this, but there isn't really yet a place where these are pulled together. There are a number of individuals and groups that have created centers and produced a variety of research documents, but a lot of it is not anchored in hard academia, and so you have a sort of drift. And when you're coming back to the question and saying, well, what do we know? What's the extent of it? It's truly not really known. The extent of what one person or one group is willing to do to make money from another resource without any kind of attempt to make that lawful, to subvert the rule of law. And I think that's the scope of it, where it might occur. I think we're often behind the curve. So we look at it and say, yes, it occurred there, and it will probably occur again. And I think through a process of identifying some common factors, we're becoming much more capable of saying, okay, this is definitely an area of high risk. What you do when you've identified the high risk is again, very much in its nascency. We know that people are migrating from Bangladesh, Nepal, India and Indonesia to plantations in the palm oil industry in Malaysia. We know that West East Africans and Filipinos are going into domestic service in the Middle East. We know that there's a lot of Nepalis, Bangladeshis going to the Middle East into construction. But what then happens and what is done in both the source and destination and intermediate countries still very much unknown. And if the actual activity is unknown, then the gathering of the data is going to be very weak, because you can only gather it when you're actually engaged in doing an activity, and that hasn't really occurred yet. So there's still a lot to know, and there's absolutely no reason to be for us to be satisfied as society or confident that we have a handle on it. And I think bold statements of people saying they can make change and they want to be a hero and all this kind of stuff, it's premature. We haven't got anywhere near there at a structural level.
Right. So Duncan, at some point in time, modern slavery sort of expanded from being a human rights issue to also being a financial crime issue. Okay. And was there any specific milestone that caused this, or do you see some specific happenings that caused this change? And what do you think the banking industry should be aware of, especially on this human rights to financial crime issue?
I think, it goes back to that issue of the sort of canon of knowledge. I think the two areas which started, and for me, the two areas that seem to start the sort of process of thinking about of human trafficking were obviously those who were on the front lines engaging in social work. And then there were obviously the human rights lawyers. These are the two groups of society who really focused and paid attention. Later on, you have the supply chain and people, and you have the people in the financial crime side looking at the problem. But I think it started simply because the human rights litigation hasn't been successful yet in causing a change in the way that companies behave, if we take that, or governments in some cases. So that needs to obviously be successful, and we need to keep pushing it as a society, but it hasn't been yet. And it's probably because the conditions of it just simply weren't right. There isn't enough of society pushing behind the human rights cause, and certainly for human rights lawyers, for it to succeed. So I think part of it was structural support. Part of it was that the laws were undeveloped, and obviously anything that is multi-jurisdictional is always going to be extremely tricky to prosecute, easy to defend. And I think someone who was general counsel, operating in multiple jurisdictions sounds like a nightmare, and it is. But it's much more of a nightmare trying to prosecute across multiple jurisdictions than it is trying to defend across them. And that's, I think, unless you've sort of had seen both sides, that's not necessarily apparent. I certainly obviously never worked as a prosecutor, but since I have been doing Liberty Shared, yes, there's been much more work, particularly work in the US, that I've been doing in pursuing trying to pursue access to justice and prosecutions. And then, of course, there's a lot of work that Archana has been doing on the victim side as well. So I think that's part of it. And then suddenly other elements or other areas of society started to get involved, partially through the growth of the CSR movement, sustainability and ethical business. The problem with that was always going to be is that if we're going to call human trafficking and wildlife trafficking a crime, then the ethical business model is only going to take you so far, because its underlying rubric is that it's an ethical issue, and therefore at a sort of philosophical level, we're saying that it's not something that society believes in a sense should be punished using a penal system or a criminal justice system. So you start off, the consequences of the ethical business movement and sustainability are obviously very, very positive, but it was only ever going to take you so far, because the underlying premise is that this was about modes of behavior and manner, rather than a complete shift towards something where people would believe that they would be punished for it if they were engaged. The money laundering side which is why I was keen to use it when I started. I guess I started doing this in 2010. Was a case of, here is this unfortunate place for the banking industry where it does elide, it does conflate with social issues, and it's punishable. And that was what interested me about it, was that that system could be used to, in quotes, enforce a sort of compliance with with a social agenda, one that was not present in the regulatory framework anywhere, that was not really discussed in any detail, but it did exist because trafficking was, still was a predicate offense. Wildlife trafficking was not really a predicate offense a decade ago, and it's still struggling across a lot of jurisdictions. And certainly on the environmental crime side, obviously the legislation is patchy in many places. But the truth is that the money laundering was a place where you had a actual liability, which you don't have in non-financial industries to anywhere near the same degree. And that, that's why it suddenly changed.
Right. So, Duncan, given that a large amount of the illicit money which is generated via modern slavery, I guess, flows through banks eventually, do you think the banking industry is doing enough to identify and report suspicious transactions or customers? If not, where do you think are the gaps?
So I think the financial industry, the first thing to say is it's done a lot. In terms of, if you look at areas of society, it was not a popular industry, obviously, after the crash, and deservedly so. In amongst all of that, there were these huge money laundering fines. And I think there's a slight conflation that the money laundering fines related to the crash, which they don't really. But what that did do was it meant that the consequence of those money laundering events, created a number of deferred prosecutions. And it was really the deferred prosecutions and the threat of the inability to deal the US dollar that caused people to go, well, wait a second, you got no US dollar, you have no bank. So you need to do something pretty significant. At the same time, for me, that was kind of obvious. And that's how I saw a big opportunity, was that there were a number of financial institutions that were simply going to pick up things to show that they were going to have to, were compliant. And there was an opportunity there. And there were so many banks that were in that situation that it was obviously easy to have a discussion with them. But it was only easy to have a discussion if you found the right people. And one of the big changes in banks, and one of the things that we wanted to be part of, was we wanted to see a behavioral change in financial institutions, that they appointed people and had people in the organization who were being paid, who understood crime, who understood liability and risk, and they would receive information. So when I first started talking about it, when I was at ING, 2010, I don't think I met anybody who was in any sense formally appointed to talk about human trafficking on the risk side. There were a few CSR people, ethical business individuals, and mainly in marketing departments and other places, but you could not, and I did once, you could not go to them with a pack of information and say, look at this relates to human trafficking. They would simply not know what to do with it as a criminal matter, as a sort of money laundering issue, rather than simply an ethical business one. And that's the huge change. So whilst in amongst the sort of a decade of complexity and challenges for the financial services industry, this is, human trafficking side of things is something they've taken up, and they've taken up extremely quickly. I think one of the things is that one of the things that's very fortunate for this was that during this time, the financial services industry hired a huge number of people that were ex-law enforcement. And to be honest, they got it straight away. Whether or not, and I can't say this, so it's a question to anyone who's listening, whether or not, to the degree to which each of those people from law enforcement understands the banking industry and the services their bank offers, is a question only they will know. But my feeling is that there's still some time before you have another generation of people who both understand financial crimes, because they've benefited from the huge amount of work the current generation has just done in the last decade, and also understand banking services. So they know about loan books and trade financing and other types of debt facility and credit facility that are being offered. They understand, different types of banking services, such as, bond issuance and, investment sponsorship. And so they can understand the full range of services that any large client or sort of ambitious client is going to seek from the bank. And that, in relation to forced labor and particularly environmental issues, is where the banks are going to have the most exposure. Because as society, and we're seeing it now, obviously, in relation to the sort of huge events in the last 2 weeks of Black Lives Matter, as society starts to change its morals and starts to demand higher sort of attention and more onerous sort of more attentive behavior, then there will be a requirement for that to be reflected in the way that business is conducted. And we obviously see that with the power of ESG. We see it with the sort of movement of human trafficking and the anti-money laundering space. There will be simply more demands on the social environmental level. First, because society is changing that way, and secondly, because particularly on the environmental side, there are a lot of problems. And so what we want to see is a further integration of these issues into the banking industry and the financial industry, not just putting the burden on the shoulders of the financial crimes people, but seeing more risk management people, more lawyers, more operational people at the first line of defense become much more knowledgeable about these issues and how they relate to the bank, the services that the bank offers, rather than it just being a KYC and a SARS issue. And I'm all for filing of SARS, but I think we all know that a very small percentage of SARS get looked at and acted upon. And I think whilst there is an effort to bring in a lot more kind of artificial intelligence and use that to analyze the SARS, the reality is the amount of action that comes from those is going to be very small compared to the number signed, the numbers submitted. So there's a lot to do, which is exciting, and I think that's what is going to be really positive for our next generation. Is there is a hell of a lot to do, but there is a hell of a lot that can be done, and that's probably better than anything else. Is that it's clearer what we need to do than ever before to try and ameliorate and mitigate some of these social issues.
Right. So Duncan, do you think that the banking regulators and the FIUs of each country, especially those that are heavily involved in this, are giving enough attention to ensure that banks comply or are identifying and reporting these transactions?
I think there is, in an absolute sense, there is a lot to do, and there is a need for much more. Against which you've got to say, well, what are the resources? What are the other issues that are also there? And and what might occur, what might emerge? And I think, for example, we must look at the COVID situation and say, well, suddenly this emerges, it turns the world upside down. How would FIUs, how does the banking industry respond to that kind of thing? Well, initially it's got to reorganize itself to keep going, and it's got to handle the fact the economy has taken a global economy has taken a massive hit. So as much as, from an idealistic perspective, you want to demand more and more, I know from professional level and a realistic level that they need to sort themselves out. They need time. In terms of the FIUs, obviously the FIUs in each country are very much dependent on the money that's made available to them. And of course, if we talk about sort of national FIUs rather than sort of banking FIUs, then one of the biggest problems is can they retain staff? Are people committed to that kind of career? It's the problem with all regulators is you need the right kind of people, and you need the right kind of finances behind the regulator too. And of course, that is very much sensitive to the winds of political change. So I think obviously there's a lot to do, but what we do, I think, have is we do now know, and I'd like to think we've been part of that. We have a better understanding about the parts of society that are involved, and some of those have become so, like the financial crimes profession. Some of them have yet to really, stand up. I'd like to see more corporate lawyers be talking about this and understand this issue. And the reason for that is because, particularly in relation to forced labor, it's going to affect your client relationships. If you are a financial institution and you have a lot of different services that you're providing to a client, and they are found to have forced labor in parts of their business as subsidiaries, or in parts of their business as supply chains, then what are you going to do? How are you going to untangle your relationship? Are you just going to cut it off? I think that doesn't necessarily make sense all the time. Are you going to have to untangle it? You're going to have to put in some sort of remediation plan. This is not to fall on the heads of the financial crimes AML guys. This is a legal issue. It's a business issue. We haven't even got to that yet. Any bank that is offering payroll services to a client has to think, are those payroll services being abused to cause forced labor? Because wage theft is a key indicator of forced labor. Obviously, this is about money. And there aren't so many banks that offer payroll as a sole service. It's generally bundled, because it's essentially correspondent banking, bundled into other corporate services. So, you're naturally going to have a conflation with other things, other interests. And the other issue that I think is really, really important is that you can't just look at it from the perspective of your client. As a bank, you have two clients. You have the employer, who's involved, say, in this case, in forced labor, and you have the employee often, who is also an account holder at your bank. And you have a duty to treat your clients the same and to treat them fairly. And where there is a fiduciary duty, it just increases how onerous this is. This is a natural position of conflict of interest. It seemed and made full sense to offer it as a bank services, as a commercial service. Why wouldn't you? And most employers and employees would say, well, if I can send money to the employee and the employer says, and I can receive my money more quickly from my employer, then why wouldn't we have the same bank account? And that seems very pragmatic. But where then suddenly there is forced labor, then immediately that actually becomes an area of conflict. And I don't think we're over that at all. The financial industry has, as far as I can tell, there's no real discussion about that conflict of interest. And as an indicator of that, you see a lot of banks talking about financial inclusion for trafficking victims. Well, most people in forced labor are not being paid cash. They're being paid in banks. So a lot of the victims of forced labor already have bank accounts. They're included in the financial system already. And that's one of the ways in which they're coerced. So we've had incidences where the bank is the banker for both the employer and the employee. And then the employer uses that relationship, because it is the same bank, to manipulate the employee. Well, the bank's at the center of this, and you've got the predicate offense, and you've actually got the money flowing repeatedly every month. So after a number of months or a number of years, there is very little defense to say that you couldn't know. You could have easily done due diligence. You could have looked at the numbers and gone, all of the payments to these employees over the last year, 2 years, 3 years have been very variable. And the question is that an indicator? So on the one hand, sure, we must look at nail bars in New York and in Thailand and places, and look to see when they're depositing money. And nobody wants to bank the money of sex traffickers, so we can eject them from our client portfolio very easily. But that will not be so easy when people start to look at big businesses or medium-sized businesses where they have a huge, say, revolving loan facility with that client, and then they realize the client has been involved in something like forced labor. How do you reconcile that? How do you work your way out of that? We're not there yet. That is not discussed. I've been looking at it for the last 2 years, and I've been having some conversations with various people. I have to admit, all I've done is ask them whether they're looking at it, and the response I always get is no. And then for my own personal, I've just been leaving the discussion at that because I'm just curious to see the level of thinking on this issue.
So, Duncan, it is well known that proceeds from activities involving modern slavery or even other crimes may be further used to carry out more predicate crimes, right, such as terrorist activities, for example. So, do you think governments are well aware of this? And in your experience, are they doing anything to make this an issue of national security? Or is that a bit far-fetched?
No, I think it's exactly right. I think certainly since I began looking at this, and as Liberty Asia and then Liberty Shared, we had more information. We have had not a very close, but a sort of on and off again relationship with people asking, do you have information about this? And we provided what we could, which is not a huge amount, I would say. I mean, there is a sort of structural issue that, first of all, if you're working in transnational organized crime, your very nature of it obviously going to completely ignore borders. They're simply obstacles that you have to, remove or get past. If you're a state government, you've got very specific boundaries. They are your borders. You do not have any right to go into other people's jurisdictions unless that's agreed. So it's there instantly is the obvious sort of conflict that creates a problem of dealing with organized crime and trafficking as a security issue. And I think the fact that one's borders are easily transgressed is the first national security issue. So that's the first problem. The second thing is what are people trafficking? They're obviously perhaps trafficking your population, that your society into another person's society to do what? What else are they trafficking? Are they taking natural resources away? Are they bringing in weapons? Are they bringing in drugs? So these things definitely converge, because we know that from examples of various organized crime activities, but also we know that from the victims, that they also have witnessed the movement of all sorts of things. So, and of course, there's the logic of it. If you have built a distribution channel, you are, a pipeline, you are going to throw as much down that pipeline as you possibly can in order to make as much money as you can. So whether that is wildlife or drugs or people or guns or organs or antiquities, then you are going to try that, and that's what I think we're seeing. So I think a classic example is obviously the dark web as a place to transact all manner of things, and but that is also has to be physically delivered, and the banking industry finds itself, unfortunately, as part of that nexus. Money has to be moved, and whether that is moved by in the formal regulated system or outside it is a different matter. But definitely, in order for people engaged in these activities to make money, the activity has to take place, and then the money has to come back in the other direction in some way. So absolutely.
My last question to you, Duncan. I think we've covered a lot of ground. A lot of our listeners are really bankers. So, do you have any operational advice for them? Because I think it's well known that yes, all this money moves through bank accounts. But what do you think are some of the steps that maybe they should be taking in terms of implementing the correct red flag indicators or conducting the right sort of due diligence on their customers, so that they can better identify, whether there is something fishy happening in their accounts, which would be linked to, the whole modern security concept?
I think, to make this sort of brief and simple, I think the first thing you've got to do is, as someone in a modern 21st century bank, is that you have to obviously recognize, and I say obviously because this is obvious, and people will sort of groan perhaps at me, but you have to recognize that society is obviously changing very quickly. I think anybody who's working at the investment end of financial services knows that there has long been this predicted big wealth transfer from boomers to millennials into Gen Z. And the question has always been, is what sort of investors will millennials and Gen Z be? And the answer is that they are highly socially conscious. And unfortunately, the way that, say, Gen X and boomers have looked at this problem was not that these transgressions that millennials and Gen Z and what I think is after Generation Alpha, they look at it as these things as almost punishable, and I think increasingly so. Whether it's gender rights or whether it's the environment, they look towards the fact that people should not do things, and they will act. But the current environment is one more of ethics and reputational issues and morality, and that doesn't necessarily. The feeling is that doesn't necessarily lead to a punishment. So, if you're in the operations, you've got to think society is going to change, and there's every indication that it's changing towards it being more onerous, to there being greater responsibility. And for some people who are, who don't share those views, we have this sort of argument in the UK about the statues of, historical slave traders being demolished, and a lot of people don't agree with it. This is a simple, in a sense, a simple argument compared to something like how do you run a bank, but the reality is a lot of people within the operations will have differing views as discussion gets pushed further and further into their daily life as to the degree to which they agree with it. And so the first operational problem is are there any lines in sand? Do we society change demands industry and demands the individual to accept those demands? So that's the first problem. And then how do you reflect that in the operational side? Well, it has to be holistic. It has to be that everybody from the frontline people to the C-suite, to the financial crimes people, to the middle office, all essentially following the same kind of some degree of social accord or understanding that these are some of the principles on which an organization is going to pursue. Without that, it will become it could become quite vociferous, with people simply saying, well, there's a point at which I don't agree. I don't agree that this cause is as important as other people are saying, and I'm not prepared to implement red flags to look for it, or I'm not prepared to sit and discuss it for 2 hours. And these are some of the issues that will arise, I think, pretty quickly over the next 2 or 3 years. And we're seeing it now at the moment. So red flags will also not be enough. There's only a certain amount of data that is coming into the sort of large open source environment that you can keep scraping. And earlier on, you need data. So some of this is going to fall back to just instinct and professionalism and practice, is that the technology is going to get us a long way, but the data is not. So we need also to be thinking on our feet. We need to use also human skills and say that technology and human skills must be done in parallel and in tandem, and we must work hard, to make sort of human experience much more relevant again. And that's not to say that it isn't, but a lot of the human training so far has actually been on technology, rather than thinking, what do we understand about society? What do we empathize with? What sort of organization are we? In an operational way, not in a kind of existential way, although that is probably part of it. So I think those are the challenges of the operational environment. And then to look back at the technology and the systems, look back at the organizational structure and the operational structure and the enterprise risk management framework, and say, how does all that fit in with the kind of society and world we're going to be living in, and the kind of demands that people want on these social and environmental issues, because they will be part of, and they are part of business. And increasingly, they will be part of a sort of criminal justice framework, which for me, they should be.
Excellent. Duncan, thank you so much for joining us today. I think I learned quite a few new things about this area, and I'm sure many of our viewers also will gain a lot of insights from what you just said. So thanks for joining us.
Thanks very much, Shirish. It's been a pleasure.
Super. And listeners, join us again next Friday. This is Shirish and Duncan signing out.
Goodbye.